in seminary, we had a set of people moved into our city who were refugees from the Cambodian killing fields of Pol Pot. And they were from Vietnam and Laos. And I started recruiting other seminary students, and we ended up with 4 teams that would take a different language group each and started trying to reach them. It was just fascinating to me. The cross-culturalness of it right there in Dallas, Texas. And also the sense of finding the people who are called to cross-cultural apostolic work. So it was a great time, and I had 3 Cambodian co-workers who were really emerged as on the same kind of level as me in the planning of churches. And even when I went away for the summer, they were doing it in other places in America and also in Cambodia, going back there. So it was kind of stunning to see the way multiplication was starting at that time. That was in the early 80s. Well, all of the people who were educated were killed. And so almost everybody had a second grade education or less. But it was amazing to me how intelligent they were and how strong they were at remembering things and repeating good patterns that they were convinced about, repeating those patterns. And so they were really strong doers. They were deeper in theological reflection than most of my Western friends were. But yet my Western friends thought of them in the opposite, that they were just simple-minded village people. And they were. But they could really go deep in the scripture and the reflection, discussion, and actively make disciples right away. I had done some cross-cultural work when I was in back earlier years, and I think it just was confirming that I was a good fit for that Asian set of people, and really had a lot of dreams to go to Asia, to be involved in. Interesting for me, it's a combination of theological education and apostolic church planting, which is kind of, for many people, strange bedfellows, but I just felt really called to that. And some of those that I had been mentoring preceded me as missionaries to the Asian world. And then through supporting them and them filling us in on all the things we should come and join them and do, it was a natural link to get to Asia.
Okay, so how did that unfold? What happened next?
Well, in that period, my wife had a lot of childbearing challenges. We lost 4 children and during pregnancy, and we felt we needed to stay in the U.S. until that chapter was closed. So I was 7 years of pastor in Southern California first, and really itching to get into a more cross-cultural setting and more directly church planting as compared to quite a lot of administrative things needed to continue the programs at the church. And so when that period was finished and my wife in particular was ready to go, then we went into a seminary situation where I'm continuing to be a professor now these 30 years later. Yeah, but it was especially designed to where the students who were Asian had to start churches in order to graduate. So that was a requirement. Using a more standard church planting model, but not necessarily tied to buildings or some of the things we connect to church planting. But it was more open in our country in those years. People could set up a projector and show the Jesus film and, that kind of thing. And so they'd had great growth. And that's where I really wanted to use my teaching gifts in combination with where the apostolic push was going forward. And so we got into that and learned a lot from our students while they were planning their churches in order to graduate in the beginning. So that was 4 years of language learning to be a professor, learning from the context of my students. They'd bring you the problems they were dealing with every weekend, when they came back. And then you, not knowing what to say, you'd ask somebody else in the group to find out who had an idea. And in that process, I began to learn about, what were the unique things in that language group.
So
But
they were students during the week, and then on the weekends they were out planting churches.
yeah. So they all had to graduate with at least, I think originally it was 25 believers baptized
Hmm.
but then at the end, I think they lowered it to 15 or
Mm.
20, somewhere in there. And, it looked kind of impossible to a lot of those students. And some of them came in as unbelievers. And
Mm.
so they had a ways to go,
Wow.
but there was quite a few that made that, met that criteria. And in those early years, we had a lot of churches getting planted, but I was concerned because there were areas we called the unreached people groups, the 99% Islamic, majority Islamic people groups. So we're not being reached by this effort. People would come from multiple denominations and come to our seminary. It wasn't any one denomination. And so I was hearing stories from all the denominations, and they were reaching Muslims, but there were more the nominals
Mm.
in the population centers, not in the more locked in, unreached people groups. So the Lord put it in my heart that to establish an organization that was made up of the local Asians, other than myself, and had the intent of reaching the unreached people groups, the 99% Islamic areas. Now, how we're going to break into those areas that weren't being reached so far
Mm.
was the challenge I really felt that God was calling me to.
Okay. And so what happened next in terms of that unfolding vision?
Well, I had the time to recruit mostly on campus. And
Mm.
so among the students who were all required to start these house church plants, I could determine, select, filter for those who were stronger in the field. And so of those, that's why I used that as my recruiting pool, my fishing pool, to find the more apostolic, more evangelistic people. And I think we started with 4 of them after a series of filtering processes. I would hire people for 2 weeks to do a cultural survey or, do short-term things until I could find the people that met the criteria I was looking for. I was looking for people who were better at evangelism than I was and weren't going to really have to learn that much from me about evangelism and were ready to really hit the road and do the hard parts of the country, the hard people groups.
Mm.
So we started with those 4. It was a process of discovering. We'd search around in the country to find out who had been reaching these unreached people groups. And most all the people I found would say, well, we don't know anything. When you learn something, let us know. We're still trying to figure it out. That was how it was in those early years. There was one group that this one guy, I still remember him saying, we're getting a new Muslim coming to the Lord. What was it 2 a month? I think he told me. He was so
Okay.
he
Okay.
was so happy at the progress at that level. Now looking back, I mean, it's nothing compared to
Mm.
what it was then. But
Mm.
at the time, he was reputed to be the strongest evangelist. So we would try to pick up wherever we could find fruit and learn something about fruitfulness in an experiment. So it was a mentality of let's experiment, let's try all kinds of different things,
Mm.
and let's see what fails as quickly as we can, so we can
Mm.
get to the next thing that might be more effective. And let's keep track of what's more fruitful and what's less fruitful. So it was an experimental research and design group. So we started in '98, and it took us about 2 years to get to the first believer group of just 4 believers.
Mm.
Looking back, I wonder how I stuck with it or the others stuck with it
Mm.
because it was really slow going at the start.
Mm.
And we did a lot of cultural research. Um, so we came up with some crazy ideas on how to do things that most Westerners would never think of or even maybe approve. We were praying, trying to match our prayers with how they were praying, how they would go to Islamic big men to get their prayers said over them. And we were in some ways mimicking some of that, but in other ways adapting it to make it match to the scripture. Didn't violate my conscience. I don't think it violated the conscience of any good Bible explorer unless you're locked into your denominational policies. But in that process, we found one of the young couples found the first believer praying for the sick. And what happens is Islamic big men have Quranic verses and they read it and then they burn it and they put the ashes in the paper and they have you drink it for the healing. So what this young couple did, they didn't ask my permission. They had learned about this. So they prayed over a glass of water, prayed scripture over a glass of water verbally, had the person drink it, and then prayed for healing. And the person was healed.
Wow.
And then later that week, she was visited by someone who was sick, a relative. And she just repeated the same patterns over again. And she kept asking them for more prayers. Mm-hmm. And I said, Tim, what are you doing? You're eating your donuts and not doing anything. And she's out there doing your work for her. You got to give her more prayers, So we worked hard at giving them more prayers because they were ritually oriented to prayer. You couldn't say prayers outside of the set people. Mm. And so we wanted to give them a set of prayers and improve on the way they're praying and bring them more from their syncretism, bring them into biblical, centrality in the way that they pray. We found that as when we focused on prayers and put a lot of Bible into the prayers, we had a lot better reception than we did when we focused on teaching. And I'm from a Bible church background. You might think I'm from a charismatic background from prayers for the sick thing I mentioned. But, you read in the Bible, people being healed, and miracles happening all through the book of Acts. And we decided, well, whatever they read in the book of Acts and in the Gospels, that should be the model because that's how they're going to learn it. They're going to learn it from the Gospels and they're going to learn it from the book of Acts. They're not going to learn it from a denomination or a pattern that somebody has come to that fit. But it's got to be anchored in the scriptures and they have to believe it themselves. One of our Indonesian guys was asking questions. He was doing interviewing in the Islamic boarding houses. And he asked them, and including the teachers, have you ever experienced God? It's kind of a strange question in our language for even asking Christians. That was the way he asked it. And they would all say, well, no. How do you experience God? That was like a zinger for them. They wanted to know how to experience God in the everyday challenges of life, whether it be being bothered by demons or illnesses, for which they have very few, solutions, like we might think of in the West. They don't have the access to the doctors that we have. And they're very mystically oriented. So when they feel, there's one of their top values, intuitive feel. When they feel it's true, based on they see it, in much the way you see the Gospels. They believe it even before their head comes around. They might still have struggles with Christology of who is Christ in relation to God the Creator. But we're not discipling them in the midst of antagonistic debating. They're already convinced many times in their heart that Jesus is somehow Lord, but they can't wrap their head around it. So they need some mentoring. They need some biblical teaching, but they just want help. They want to help get over this hump they're having, and they want to be able to explain it to their friends. But it's not like we get ready for this big debate in the West. That's not common. So I was mentoring and I was still a professor full time. So this is just a part-time role that I have running these teams. They were full time. One of the guys got to 2 groups, 4, and then 3. And we thought, wow, he's got the pattern. He's got the model. And the other guys, we were trying to get to learn from him. The interesting thing is he never went beyond three.
Mm.
And then the guys kind of came along a little bit more slowly, like the tortoise and the hare. And then the other guys just slowly get one, and then they get two groups, and then they get three, and then they get four. And pretty soon the guy who had three came back to two. And I was trying to compare what was happening differently. And the guy that moved ahead quickly was convinced you have to evangelize individuals secretly, one on one. Whereas the other people said, no, we don't do anything in our culture secretly, one on one. If we do, it's a signal that it's a shameful thing.
Mm.
So we're gonna talk about the gospel differently. We're gonna talk about it together with all the young men eating boiled peanuts at the mouth of the road in the cool of the evening while they chat and strum their guitars and sing a little bit together. We're going to talk about the gospel in groupings, natural groupings of people, whether they're relatives or friends. And that means that the speed at which the gospel goes forward might have to slow down a little bit and respond to the topics they want to talk about, and then recraft them with God as central and then Jesus as central. And we develop that style. But then they have a model they can repeat, and they start reaching other groups. And so it's more about empowering local people as priests, as believer priests. And that's what became our model. Whereas the other guy never got past that. He was our team leader, and eventually he had to resign because he just couldn't get out of his singular Western thinking of one by one. But everything for us is in groupings. So that was a major fruitful practice discovery for us. You know, I mentioned that one. That's the first of maybe 20 like that. But that was a watershed issue. Everything is done in groupings that we can. You know, evangelism is done in groupings. Bible study is done in groupings, natural groupings. Leadership is done not by individual leaders, but by teams of leaders. That's how this thing goes forward.
And what do you define or describe as a grouping?
Yeah, grouping is a word I'm using just to indicate it's not like a formalized group. In other words, it's people that, you know, they're playing badminton together every Thursday night. So then they have some tea and snack together and chat, and they're friends. And also the ones sitting around with their aunt and uncle and their cousins because they live nearby, you know, and they're enjoying their time together. And then, you know, other people, maybe school teachers who are at school together, and so they see each other lots, they're chatting together. So these would be the groupings. We call it a gathering. We have I once had a bamboo ladder, and the termites came and ate the bottom rung away. So you had to be kind of in good shape to get up to the second rung. And then the termites ate the second rung. And then you could still climb it, but you had to be even a better athlete to get up to the third level. So there were fewer and fewer people could use this ladder. And that's what I think we do when we put a really high standard about what church planting means. So we have a lot of little baby steps, metrics that, so the first thing after a gathering is, a grouping is what you find. A gathering is when you bring the Bible in the discussion into a repeated discussion in the gathering. And then it turns in the grouping. So it turns the grouping into what we call a gathering. In other words, it's a Bible discussion gathering. It might not yet be looking at the Bible in a written form, but it's got an agenda of talking about spiritual things together repeatedly. So we start counting. It used to be we started counting in gatherings. We don't have time to count gatherings anymore. But at the beginning, this was really helpful. And then we went from gatherings to what we called mini groups. That was when a gathering of maybe 5 people, there would start to be 1 or 2 believers. We would call it a mini group, MINI group. And then when it got up to be 3 or more, that's when we started using the word group, like the word ecclesia is used, of just a gathering of people around a spiritual purpose. And our groups now average 5 or 6 believers. It's kind of it's our smaller ecclesia unit. And then from there, the next level up this metrics ladder is a cluster church. It's about 10 groups that are linked to each other. They've generated, like one has generated some second generation groups. And the second generation groups have generated some third generation groups. And it's around 10 or more groups and linked to each other. Then we call that a cluster church. So it's our second level church after the small groups. And we don't feel we can do all biblical things in the small group, but we also feel we can't do all biblical things in just the cluster church. We got to do it in a combination of small groups, cluster church, and also small region church. And we see in the book of Acts, the word ecclesia is used at all 3 levels: small house church, city church, which I think of as a cluster church. All of the little house churches in Ephesus were called the Church of Ephesus. And then there was Church of Judea, a wider gathering of. So we do all 3 levels. In my role, I didn't always know how to get to the next level of progress, but by describing in general terms the next level of progress and talking about it in different ways, and then celebrating it when the first people started to get examples of it, it began to give them something clear to focus on, the next mark, the next milestone, like the hiker going up the mountain, to celebrate what's been achieved so far and use that as a basis for going forward. I found, or they found me, some creative, innovative, apostolic-like people from this country who were excited to pursue those outcomes, that we called it fruit. We feel the biblical idea is fruit, different descriptions of fruit that are celebrated in the books of Acts. We would study that a lot. What's celebrated in the book of Acts for progress? And then what they felt is they had room to innovate and move and create and do the kind of thing that their spirit was more free to do. We had an earthquake, and it had shaken down, I think, 250,000 houses. So it was a massive destruction. And we had some money, and enough to build 10, I think, house cores. We paid about $550 at the time. That's a whole story, but how do you give them a minimum of a 3 by 6 meter house with some structure to it so it wouldn't be shaken by the next earthquake? But anyway, we were running out of money, and then some other people threw their money with us. We got to 110. We were running out of money. So I told the guys, they all had their lists of people that would get the next houses. And we were doing church planning around this house building, getting a lot of fruit. And I warned them, I said, we're going to soon be out of money, and we're going to have the first people on the list who don't get the houses. I said, you got to prepare the people or you're going to be in big trouble when they don't get the houses. Well, the first one on the list on this particular guy's list, Mr. L, they had thrown together a bamboo shack. His foot was damaged in the earthquake badly. He was walking on the side of his foot. His daughter had encephalitis, big head. They were in terrible, condition and really needy. We didn't have any money. So he found a Japanese organization that would give money only for a bathroom. And he thought he could talk them into using the bathroom money for the house, but they wouldn't budge on this. It was so funny. We were just shooting about this. And so they wanted that. We were only paying $550 for the whole structure, but they were paying $850 just for the bathroom. Yeah, and they wanted to tile it, and have proper lighting and all this stuff. We just thought this was ridiculous, but that was their deal. And so they attached this, and we called it the five-star bathroom to this bamboo shack. And it was the talk of the whole area. They just thought it was the Indonesians, the people living locally just thought it was so ridiculous that they were wasting this money on the bathroom. But it had such good lighting. They put a chair in there, and that's where people would go in to read. They turned it into the reading room and everything. Well, in this process, Mr. L asked the person one day, well, what do you do to deserve this five-star bathroom? Well, actually, nothing. I didn't do anything. They just came to me. It just came. And he just started defining that as grace. This was God's grace. This was an undeserved gift. And then from that discussion of the bathroom as a grace gift, he reached into the gospel about how the gospel was a grace gift. I said, you're kidding me. You went from that? You went from the five-star bathroom to the grace gift to the gospel? Yeah. The guy followed right along, and the whole family trusted in the Lord over that. And I thought, yeah, that's the guy. These are the kind of people. The same guy later on, his son was dying of epileptic seizures. He was 15. We wondered how long he would last. And I asked him one day, I said, how you doing with the stress of your son being in the hospital and having these seizures? And he said, it's so stressful. The other day, I just had to go to other parts of the hospital and do evangelism. That's what he wanted to do to relieve his stress.
Yeah.
I thought, yeah, these are the kind of people. They're out there. God picks these local people in any culture, and they can do a phenomenal amount of ministry for the Lord, but they need some elbow room. They need a lot of free space with accountability and a brotherhood with other apostolic people.
What other key lessons or breakthroughs did God lead you through?
Well, tied to what I've already mentioned, we made an effort to make an experimental culture so that people could experiment and try things, but they had to be at low cost in money and low cost in time and risk. So one of the guys who has now passed away, Mr. Z, he would design two experiments at the same time based on alternate theories of which way would get the most fruit. And he put them in conflict with each other to get a true test and understand which one was the most fruitful. And it was amazing sometimes, counterintuitively, how he would come up with these ideas. And then, they would go forward. And then we would toss out the experiment, things learned through experiments that were not as fruitful. And we'd spend more time on the fruitful things. Well, for example, we initially did, I think, 4-month training of people that had been selected by other mission agencies in our country, other Asian mission agencies in our country. We allowed them to give us 2 people to train each, and we would train them for 12 months in hopes they would become good church planners in the unreached people groups. Virtually none of them really worked out. So I was trying to decide how are we going to discontinue this program, because we were kind of invested in it. We'd done a lot of time training, designing the training, and we had good trainers, and they were good church planners and everything. One of the local people came to me and said, we need to discontinue this. It's not that fruitful. I'm going to try 1-day training and 2-day training instead of 4-month training. So he started doing that, and he said the objective isn't to train them. The objective is just to find the people. So he said I would go to a church of 400 where they had a a real missions vision, and some figure in the church had a real heart for reaching the Muslims. And we would ask him, could you pick 10% out of the 400? Could you pick 40? We don't want to train any more than that. We want to just train the 10% that are most likely to be effective at reaching Muslims. And then what we would do is give them a 1-day training. I didn't think this would work. Gave them a 1-day training. And out of the 40 that were trained, we'd often find that about 4 of them would actually take the training and apply it in the field and consistently do it over the next months and keep giving reports back to our trainer and ask for more coaching. And then we would put all of our training energy into these 4 people. And those guys invariably really took off and really became fruitful. And I think in the first 20 cases of churches like this, I believe in every case, the total number of Muslims reached and discipled in groups became more than the original church. In other words, if the church was 400 to begin with, after 4 years, we found it was more than 400 in the underground church. But one of the rules they had to agree to is they had to agree not to bring those people into their original church. They had to start a second church underground, under the radar. The same leadership was in charge. It was their own church, but they had 2 churches. And they had to agree not to tell the main church what was happening underground. Because as soon as that happened, it invited all kinds of troubles with security. We had martyrs, but also fear became so strong a factor. And so that was one example. I come from a real strong background of training and teaching. So to go down to a 1-day training, but you have to rethink it like it's a way to select the right people. And then the real training happens from the people that are apprenticing in the field.
What's the original vision God's given you for this part of the world?
Well, in the early stages, when we were starting, and there was no unreached people group with 1,000 believers reported from any organization, we were doing all we could to pray for about 1,000 believers, 200 small groups of 5 is what we aimed for originally. And our speed of doubling was shortening the time it took to double. And so we went from 52 one year to 110 small groups 2 years later. And I suddenly realized, wow, 200 small groups it's too small of a sense of where we're going. And I felt like God was stirring my heart to say, you're going to have to dream bigger. That's what I felt God was saying to me. Ephesians 3:20, God is able to do far more than we ask or think, ask or even imagine. And so I was in a conference and I was trying to get up the faith to believe that we should target 2,000 small groups from 200. And I felt like the Spirit of God kept saying to me, no, like with that kind of a voice scolding, no, 20,000. And I was going, Lord, I can't imagine what to do with 110 small groups and what my role is. I'm swimming, trying to figure it out. I can see we're going to get past 200. I can't imagine what part I'll play if we had 20,000 small groups. And God answered, yeah, but that's what I want you to see. Your job is to see out ahead. And the reason is your part will get smaller and smaller as a percentage of the whole. But I want you to think about, see, I grew up on a farm and I was the littlest guy in every class. When I was 16, I weighed about 92 pounds. Uh, I didn't even hardly make the lowest weight class in wrestling. And so to move heavy things, I had to learn about levers, how to use a lever and leverage. You place the fulcrum, to get a little bit of strength, accomplishing more movement. And basically, God was saying, I want you to think about leverage. I want you to think about your own role humbly, that you have a limited role. But how is that limited role going to be placed? That's what I want you to think about. And so that started us off on a process that then I had to duplicate in some of my conversations with some of the guys I was coaching, and them to kind of break out of their limits on how they were thinking about what God would do. So we put it in a number. It doesn't mean the number is everything. I know there's a lot of Christians who will make a big deal about numbers. We want quality, not quantity. And I feel like saying to him, okay, open the Bible for me and show me the verse that tells me we don't want quantity. Because what I'm seeing is that we're having reports of quality and quantity in the book of Acts, and to some degree in the Gospels. And what I saw from all the farmers I ever knew, I never saw an apple grower say, I want quality but not quantity. I never saw a dairy farmer say, I want quality but not quantity. And there's no farmers like that. They all want both. And so why do we have to do something abnormal and call that Christian? Why don't we go for both at the same time and realize they're symbiotically related to each other?
Yeah.
And how has the progress gone towards those 20,000?
Well, it's gone well. But I'm actually not going to discuss the numbers.
Yeah.
But you've
made good progress.
It's been a surprise. It's been a surprise. It keeps exceeding what I expected. I mean, almost every quarter when the counts come in, I have to cry, I have to weep about what God's been doing.
Yeah.
Because it's so touching. And it's also has it's personal. I was a math teacher. I know certain people don't like math, but for me, it's personal. It's part of my love for the Lord, and it's part of His love for me that He's involved me in this.
Yeah.
So it's been a wonder. It's been a wonder to see the Muslims. And to speak of tears, I mean, one guy would cry every time he sees me because he'd killed a lot of people who looked somewhat like me. And yet he would feel the grace of God again each time he would see me. How it had broken through and it had found him. That issue of the grace of God breaking through and turning hard hearts into soft, malleable hearts in His hand. It's a wonderful thing. It's such a privilege to be a part of that.
Yeah.